Hey, what's up guys? So today we're checking out Gigabyte's RTX 2080 Ti gaming OC, the mainstream card in their lineup. If you missed my 2080 Ti performance review where we looked at how the GPU performed in games, you can check that out in the top comment down below. And you can also find our content on the RTX 2080 down there as well. In this video, however, we're exclusively going to be looking at the gaming OC from Gigabyte and see how it does in terms of thermals and overclocking. And as I said, this is the mainstream card positioned above their 2-slot WindForce card and below their much thicker Aorus card, which is actually yet to be released. Coincidentally, that makes this card roughly just under 2.5 slots, which means that it's just thick enough to provide slightly more superior cooling than the 2-slot Founders Edition card, but also just a hair too thick to fit in cases where you are limited to 2 slots like the Dan A4. For those that do require 2-slot cards, I would suggest either picking up Gigabyte's WindForce card, EVGA's XC, or Nvidia's own Founders Edition. The card isn't too large though, it's under 300mm long and also under 120mm tall, so apart from being roughly 2.5 slots, this card should fit in most mid-tower cases, even with front-mounted radiators and fans. Otherwise, we're looking at a pretty neutral design here, no hint of colors or accents at all, and those who want a plain black card with sufficient cooling will certainly rejoice. The Gigabyte logo on the side of the card is the only RGB element that you'll find here, and this is controlled through Gigabyte's RGB Fusion software. The backplate is nice and neutral also, plain black with Gigabyte text in the center. For cooling, we've got 3 82mm fans on the shroud cooling the fin stack, and these adopt the same WindForce cooling design, which has the middle fan spinning in the opposite direction to supposedly reduce turbulence. Disassembling the card is a breeze with all screws accessible via the backplate, with all of the screws locking in the heatsink to the PCB. The cooler is fairly sufficient for the gaming OC, with 6 copper heat pipes making their way through the fin stack and also getting direct contact to that massive TU102 GPU die. There's no base plate on the card for the PCB, which we've seen with other models. Here the VRM and memory modules are in direct contact with the heatsink via thermal pads. The VRM layout seems pretty much identical to Nvidia's Founders Edition 2080 Ti, where we have the V-Core VRM split across either side of the GPU, 13 phases here and then an additional 3 for the memory. We're also getting the same 70 amp power stages, which are the FDM 3170s, although I'm not sure exactly how these are being controlled. But there are 2 8-phase PWM controllers being used, one on the upper right of the board and then one on the back. Overall, a pretty strong VRM, and it really is a shame that GPU voltage and the power limit is so restricted here. Overclocking was pretty subpar, but as I always say here, it heavily depends on the quality of the GPU that happens to land on your card. In this case, I was only able to add a 70 MHz offset to the GPU before things became unstable, but the GDDR6 memory was good for an additional 750. Power limit was also limited to just 111%, which is a bit disappointing, as this card was hitting that with no problem at all. Some of the more expensive options like the EVGA XC and XC Ultra are allocated up to 130%. And performance gains were as expected, with only about a 1% gain on average given the very restricting power limit and mediocre GPU clock offset. In contrast, overclocking our RTX 2080, which was MSI's Gaming X Trio, saw over a 10% bump in performance in Warhammer Vermintide 2, and this was because the power limit was a much more generous 129%, and the GPU allowed an offset of 150 MHz. And as the title suggests, the gaming OC does perform better than Nvidia's Founders Edition 2080 Ti in terms of thermals. Where the 2080 Ti FE typically performs at around 72 degrees C from what I've seen online, the gaming OC settled to just 65 degrees C at a fan RPM of 1650. The VRM and memory are also operating far below spec here, which is great to see. These were measured with a K-type thermocouple since there were no sensors on the board. Overclocking raised the GPU and MOSFETs by 1 degree, which given the mild overclock you would probably expect, and the memory module that was measured did exceed 70 degrees C, but again, this is still very safe in terms of thermals, especially given the overclock. So overall, a pretty decent card. There's certainly nothing to complain about here other than the price. At $1,200 US, it is a bit of a hard sell over the Founders Edition card in my opinion. There you are getting slightly worse thermals, but you are getting a slightly larger power overhead, which means that your GPU clock will boost a lot higher and you will be able to maintain that. Not with this, where you're basically jumping between 1900 and 2000 megahertz with that overclock in place. Otherwise, if you're not overclocking, you probably shouldn't be worried about that power limit. If you do have this card, thermals are really solid and the VRM layout is excellent as well. And so this will conclude our RTX coverage for a little bit until I get another card and until new RTX games are actually released and until those are something that we can actually test. Now we will resume our usual coverage on the channel, and there are some very exciting videos coming up, so make sure you subscribe. As always guys, a huge thanks for watching. Subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll see you all in the next one.